Now, it's time for Modern Money Doughnuts with Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond.
Hi, everyone. My name's Gabrielle Bond. I am an activist and organiser in Adelaide, South Australia, land of the Kaurna people. I run a group called the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group with a whole bunch of volunteers. And I'm also I'm the CEO of Modern Money Lab, where I work with Stephen Hale. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, Gabby. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Still dark.
Good evening, everybody else. My name's Steven, as Gabby just said. I'm an adjunct associate professor at Torrens University and an economist with Modern Money Lab. Today, we're joined by somebody who, in my opinion, is one of the world's most important economists, with a long list of journal papers and an even much longer list of media appearances. He developed a mathematical model of Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis during the 1990s, which allowed him to predict the global financial crisis. His 2001 book, Debunking Economics, is one of my favorite books. It's one of the best critiques of neoclassical economics ever written. His Minsky software package is being used increasingly widely for realistic economic modeling. And his recently released book, The New Economics, a Manifesto, incorporates everything I just said and much more, including a realistic incorporation of energy into economics and a demolition of the treatment of climate change in neoclassical economics. Steve is a Senate candidate in Australia for a new political party called TNL, or the New Liberals, in this year's Australian federal election. And I'd like to, first of all, offer you a warm welcome, Steve, and secondly, ask you why you're doing this thing. Why are you standing?
Well, the actual line that came to me was that I've failed to get the ear of politicians, so why not try to get the mouth of one? Because we know the frustration where we say, government debt is not debt. Government creates money, et cetera, and then you go and read the next day's newspaper reports, and it's we're going to go bankrupt because we're borrowing too much to run the deficit, et cetera, and you think, for Christ's sake, you bastards are never going to listen to us, are you? Well, I might become one of you, and then you're going to have to listen to me inside the Senate chamber. So that's the basic motivation.
Well, that's pretty well said. I think. I mean, we definitely do try and meet with politicians and give them a copy of Stephanie's book and say, here, look, it's all in this book. If you just read it, it'll completely blow your mind. We've had sort of warm to lukewarm to cool to frosty receptions, but yeah, I think you'd be hard to press to find a politician who will outrightly say, explain how you just explained that the difference between a currency issuer and a currency user.
Yeah, I had a meeting with somebody who will soon, if Labor win the election, be a cabinet minister with Stephanie when she was in Australia. And the only thing that this person could think of to talk about at the meeting was to ask Stephanie how come Bernie Sanders was so popular, and whether she had any magic prescription for the ALP, which wasn't doing so well at that stage, to garner some of that popularity themselves. You've written much of, I don't know whether the whole of, TNL's economics platform, Steve.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing was I was just observing the party when it first turned up, because Victor Klein's profile has got a fairly aggressive statement saying, we're not going to keep the bastards honest, we're going to put the bastards behind bars. And that was fairly emphatic, and probably more emphatic than I would have been willing to be, even though I've got heartily sick of watching the obvious corruption in Australian politics these days. But that had me intrigued. And then out of the blue, he wrote to me saying, would you like to be our economic advisor? And I sort of asked, well, why did you choose me? He said, I've read Debunking Economics.
Oh, excellent.
Thought, okay, cover to cover. So there's immediate awareness of my approach to economics. And then he's also read a lot of the work on modern monetary theory. So he's actually, Victor is a lawyer by profession. He now makes his living these days editing the law reports. He's not practicing as a lawyer directly, but he's doing the law report editing. So he had to train himself in a different area once he decided he wanted to start a political party. And I had great respect for that. And the more I've got to know him, the more I've got to like him and respect him as a person as well. So hence I first of all accepted the request to be their advisor. And then he decided, well, it was worth having a punt at the North Sydney electorate he lives in as a House of Reps member, and he asked me to take over the Senate. So I thought, well, why not? In for a penny, in for a pound.
I think the Senate should be much more achievable than winning a lower house seat when you're not a member of a major party pre-selected into a kind of, with the party machine behind you.
And we speak as we've just been in an independence campaign in South Australia. She might actually win, the person that we were. It's still not decided, but it is very, very difficult. But the Senate is maybe a possibility, as Gabby was saying.
It's easier. I mean, the thing about the Senate, we've got an international audience here or an Australian audience?
Quite a big Australian audience, yeah.
Okay. Because Australia's Senate position is quite unusual. If Americans are used to having 2 senators per state, we have 12. And half of them are elected every year. So the elections last normally 3 years. That's the maximum term. So when you're elected as a senator, you're there for 6 years. And to get elected, you need 1/7 plus 1 vote. Okay, that's the base. They call that a quota. So that means about 14.5% of the vote will get you elected. But it's not just first the past the post, it's preferential. So you number the candidates at least numbers 1 to 6 for parties. And so if it's quite possible to get very low vote as a first preference vote, but get additional distributions, first of all, for people who might put you second and their party gets a lower number of votes again and their vote gets passed to you. Or the major parties get 2 but not 3 quotas, and then their excess votes are distributed. So it's a strong possibility, but I've handicapped myself, I'm afraid to say.
Oh, why's that?
I've got prostate cancer.
Oh, goodness.
So, yes. So I was, I've got to go for the biopsy and then have it, if that proves to be as positive as the blood test turned out to be, then I'll be having an operation before the election is called. So for about 4 weeks, I'll be out of commission, and I'm doing the best I can now to put myself out there and to put my Keen for the Senate website together. But if you want a handicap, I chose a pretty good one.
Oh wow! When did you get this news?
When I was out in Australia in January, so or rather December. I'm not exactly your spring chicken career politician, so I turn 69 next week, and I thought I'd do an overall, check the state of my health when I came back to Australia in early December, and then I didn't expect. I've had some sort of warning, the usual hassles a guy gets when prostate cancer comes his way, but I thought I'd be, I thought I had reasonable odds, mate, because 2 of my brothers-in-law have had it as well. And bang, I found no, I've joined them. So we now share prostate stories, and we'll shortly be storing prostate war stories. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And so you're having the operation here in Australia?
In Thailand. Because my personal situation is crazy. I'm currently back in Amsterdam, which is where I was living when COVID broke out. My wife, who's lived here for 25 or 30 years, is Thai, and Thailand was doing so much better on COVID than so we decided that we're getting out of here. We went back to Thailand, spent about 2 years there, and now we've decided to probably settle over there permanently. So I'm selling the apartment here, and then we move back and are buying a place in Bangkok. But of course, if I'm successful in the election, then I'll be joining the renting class in Sydney. And renting and living in Sydney.
Back to Australia if you're successful.
Yeah.
Well, I hope very much you will be successful.
So do I, mate. But I'm just being realistic. It's a tough ask. It was hard enough with the invisibility of the independence and so on to have a cancer diagnosis thrown in the middle of the campaign just sort of releases, Yeah.
So. Well, you're still on the ballot paper, and please, if you're living in New South Wales, when you come to election time, look for that box TNL on your big white ballot paper. Put a 1 in that box.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And check out keen for the Senate and TNL's platform online. Absolutely. Yeah, do we have a TNL candidate in South Australia? Do you know?
You have some of there's at least one candidate who's. I'll just bring up the website and just take a look. Of course, I've got to go across to Chrome now. Looking for computers. They're breaking down about as much as human society seems to be. But if you, I'm just looking at Chris's last name, because our prominent candidate in South Australia. His first name is Chris, and that's how I know him. Just got to check and get his second name right. So he says, filling in time while the pages turn. Chris Schmidt, and he's a candidate for Sturt.
Okay.
He's been an activist for disabled people for quite a while, and he's one candidate you have in South Australia, and I'll say
running in a lower house seat, not
only one. Yeah.
Okay, lower house seat. So the
lower house seat, yeah. In Sturt.
The electorate of Sturt is quite a big one. Is it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know the one. Yeah. So that's northeast of Adelaide. It's where the sitting member used to be Christopher Pyne and is now.
Oh, well, that's a good seat to toss.
It's actually the second most marginal in South Australia. The most marginal is. Yeah. So, yeah. Good luck, Chris. All the best to you.
Anyway, Steve, if there's anything that we can do to help with your campaign, and that extends to even if you want somebody to do the best to do an impression of you at an event when you're unavailable, then just let us know.
That's a good offer, Stephen. I'll take you up on that, I think. Yeah.
I often do an amateur version of Stephanie Kelton. On the media I can try and do an amateur version of Steve King.
You share the same first name, so glasses, 60-ish, easy.
I've actually been talking with Stephanie about doing a joint paper on modern monetary theory using my Minsky software on one side to emphasize the case she makes with conceptual logic, and of course it's going to be the SKSK paper.
It would too.
Excellent. Yeah. And anybody out there, if they the initial part of looking through at Steve's software, I think is it called MMT for Dummies or something like that?
Yeah, I've got an yeah. Have you read that chapter?
I have read that chapter. Yeah, I'll probably use that in some courses we're developing later on in the year. Because it's very accessible.
The beauty of doing it with Minsky is it makes the case that Bill and Randy and Stephanie were making for ages. It's simply the accounting. It's not anything radically new way of running an economy. Blah blah blah. It's what happens when you look at how the money flows from one bank account to another, and so like I can do the basic case of modern monetary theory in terms of showing the government as a money creator, not a money borrower, in about 10 minutes. And once you've seen it like that, it's very hard to unsee it. But the trouble is we have politicians who are first of all been trained in neoclassical economics, whether they realize that's what they're being trained in or not. And that gives them that supply and demand way of thinking about everything, which are fictions. Whereas modern monetary theory is based on the hard accounting that's involved in running, having a mixed fiat credit economy.
And it's
not only the politicians either. Some of the economists, most of the economists too.
Oh, they're write-offs. I mean, one thing I've got more and more inclined to believing as time has gone on is there's no point trying to convert a neoclassical economist. Simply, it's the same way that Max Planck couldn't convert a Maxwellian physicist to understand quantum mechanics. He just had to rely upon them all getting old enough to die or retire and have to be replaced by young people who understood quantum mechanics and were willing to continue working at it. And economics is cursed, as you would have seen I write in the manifesto, Stephen, by the fact that the crises, the anomalies for economics aren't like a physics experiment. You can forget about the anomaly, and that's what happens. And they continue getting true believers to replace them, and on you go with the same old ideology after crisis after crisis. So I'm not going to try to convert them, that's for sure. Ignore them and overwhelm is a better approach.
Yeah, although I think there are some. I mean, Steven, you're one of them who has actually sort of thought about what's really going on and changed your view.
But I'm a nobody, Gabby. It was much easier for me. If you're just an economics teacher, which is essentially what I am, you don't have as much skin in the game, and also you're probably not quite as arrogant as a famous Nobel Prize winning professor of economics, and I could name several.
Yeah, and arrogance is definitely part of it. The American system tends to generate arrogant individuals. It's either selects them or it generates them or it creates them. But the level of arrogance that economists have is quite breathtaking after you've, and having spent 50 years working with them, I'm rather sick of their arrogance when they, from what I can tell, they know damn bugger all, apart from their own theory.
But I do know the feeling of being the only one in an economics department that disagrees with everybody else. Yes.
Steve, I know you've probably talked about this many, many, many times, and you're probably a bit sick of it. But I wonder if for your listeners, you might be able to talk a little bit about what I heard you explain it to Daniel very, very clearly on the coal miners driving Teslas episode, which I'd urge everybody to go check out, about the assumptions that go into when the economists are advising the IPCC and some of the incredibly, incredibly mind-blowingly ridiculous.
I still remember because I didn't get working in climate change research until I'd actually done something that I regarded as a positive contribution of my own, and that was showing how you could bring energy into a production function and show the role of energy, because both neoclassical economics and post-Keynesian economics, when they model, they show output being produced by combining capital and labor. They don't have energy going in, and they don't have raw materials going in. And I realized that you nothing can be done without energy. Labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. And then that let me make a positive contribution. So then I thought I'd read the neoclassical stuff. I didn't expect much. What I thought I'd find is that they were taking models by scientists of the damage that climate change would do to the biosphere, and then putting an economic twist on it and putting a high discount rate, and the high discount rate meaning that they came up with trivial numbers. Instead, I found they made up their own bloody numbers with absurd assumptions that any science would throw out the window. Your paper would be rejected on sight. And the first one, which was that I'll mention the second one because it's obviously stupid. And this is that when they do what they call they do what they call an enumerative approach to add up the damages from climate change. So you work out what's going to be damaged here and damaged there, and you add them all up, and it's an adding up process. And they started, that could work, sort of, but what they assumed was that 87% of industry would be unaffected by climate change because it occurs in quote unquote carefully controlled environments. And when you look at the list of, this is the Nordhaus in 1991, when you look at the list of industries that he said were in carefully controlled environments, all of manufacturing, mining, which I think is hilarious. He didn't realize about underground mining. All the wholesale and retail services, all of the finance sector, and all of the government. And that's 87% of the American economy. And
so
this just
nothing
shows
about extreme weather, supply chain breakdowns, anything.
Yeah, none of that. And none about running out of energy, because if you run out of energy, if you suddenly find you can no longer use fossil-based energy because the climate changes are so calamitous that there's a decision, that's it, we just can't put any more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then the energy available for production would fall by 80%. And when you look at the relationship of energy to GDP and change in GDP, it's virtually 1-for-1. So if we had that much of a fall in energy, there'd be that much of a fall in GDP. Yeah. And yet they assume, and I actually saw a paper that's actually said this, that if you had, his example he gave was a 10% fall in energy would cause a 0.4% fall in GDP, because you can substitute labor and capital for energy. I mean, that's garbage,
Complete garbage,
Complete
garbage. Ridiculous. That's ridiculous as assuming we could do without agriculture.
Yeah,
and that's proportion of GDP.
But that's built into the way they model. So that was one. They then assumed that they could use data on the relationship between temperature and income today to predict what's going to happen out of climate change. Now, as soon as you make that assumption, you've trivialized it, because you know instantly that, like America, you look at continental America, New York is about 10 degrees Celsius colder than Florida, and Florida has a 20% lower GDP per capita than New York. So once you say that, you then say, well, the 10-degree increase in global temperature would only reduce GDP by 20%. That is brain dead stupid. Okay, but that's what they've done.
Well, and it'll all be dead, basically.
To be honest, Steve, when I saw you claiming that, I actually had to go and check.
Yeah, good.
So I thought, I think you had a nervous breakdown or something. This can't be right.
I know. I mean, the funny. My wife may well walk in while we're recording this, but I was in this room when I first read that paper about saying that they thought that the relationship between temperature and GDP over space, meaning i.e. what happens today with our current climate, can predict what's going to happen when we radically change the climate by increasing the amount of energy we retain from the sun. And I just thought, you bloody morons! And I had my hand. I was like this, and my wife, who's Buddhist, walked in and saw me like this and said, "What's wrong?" And I said, I'm reading climate change. She said, "Oh, why do you read that stuff? Nobody wants to know about it. You can't change anything. If we die, we die." So that broke me out of it. It was a very depressed funk when I saw it. But it was just like realizing they've got some moron on the deck of the Titanic who reckons that the icebergs are fluffy clouds that can clean the exterior of the ship as he goes through the ice field. It's about that smart. So, I expected to have to explain why a Ramsey growth model is an inappropriate framework for analysing growth over time and climate change. But I haven't even got to that stage. I haven't needed to, because their assumptions are so, if I can use French, I would, effing stupid. And yet, on the basis of those effing stupid assumptions, they put out numbers to 2 decimal places of accuracy, of course, which when politicians look at them, they say, oh, so a 4-degree increase in temperature is going to reduce GDP in 2100 by 3.67%. That's a quote from a 2021 paper, 3.67% compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of climate change, when they also tell us that the economy is going to grow by roughly 2% per year. And so it's going to be 5 times the size it is now, and it'll only be a little 3%, 4% smaller. Why worry about it? And that's exactly the way that I think politicians have thought about it. They haven't seen anything saying human civilization will be destroyed at 4 degrees Celsius. But
that message is starting to get out there now, and ordinary people are starting to, it's starting to enter people's consciousness much more, I think.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So politicians aren't going to be able to get away with just ignoring things forever.
The trouble is how catastrophic are those changes going to be? So we've had the fires in Australia. We had the floods just recently in Australia. We're going to have floods again, by the looks of it, in the same areas that got hit by those catastrophic floods a couple of weeks ago. So if you've waited this long, then you're no longer in a situation where you can taper towards a reasonable outcome. You're an overshoot, and you've got to. And will your political system hold up? That's really the question I think that we face. And one reason I'm going to Parliament is I want to be able to say in Parliament on Hansard just how delusional these assumptions are by economists, and therefore their comfortingly small numbers are completely not just wrong, they're dangerously wrong.
Yeah. Do you see any sort of positive changes in the IPCC, because there was a recent report out? Do you see the ridiculousness being toned down and some sensible voices coming in?
Funny you should ask me that. I'll actually go back to the page where I've highlighted it, and this of course you have the economists have got their own little section inside here, and on page 16-65 of the book, because it's a 3,500 page document. I mean, this is partly, if you wanted to make people not read something, why not write something 3,500 pages long and don't call it War and Peace? But on page 65, chapter 16, page 65, here is a quote from the economists: with historically observed levels of adaptation, warming of about 4 degrees Celsius may cause a 10 to 23% decline in annual global GDP by 2100 relative to global GDP without warming. Now, those are bigger numbers, 10 to 23%. But
they're still ridiculous, though.
We're still saying we'll have a civilization at 4 degrees Celsius. We won't have a civilization. If we're lucky, we'll have Mad Max. And Mad Max won't be shot in Namibia. It'll be shot in the Arctic Circle because the temperature there will be 20 degrees, it is because the Arctic's warming about 5 times faster than the rest of the planet. It's just absurd. But this is what because politicians are used to listening to economists, that's what they'll get out of the IPCC. And that is still somebody else's problem. 10% smaller in 2100, 80 years from now. Why should I bother doing anything about it?
We're well past the time when the economists shouldn't be playing any role at all in the IPCC.
They should be thrown out. I mean, the only role that they should, this is, again, the further I dig, the worse I find. And like, for example, economists, you know this, Gabrielle, do you have training in economics as well?
No, I'm actually trained as a musician, but
you're a lucky difference. Anyway, Steven knows this. They go on all about specialization, how important it is to specialize. And you'd think they'd apply it in their own bloody research, wouldn't you? So you specialize, you let the climate scientists produce the climate models, and you do the economic impact. Oh no. These little children had to go and make their own, what they call integrated assessment models, and they include their own climate models inside them. And when you take a look at the climate models, one of the models is by my favorite arsehole, pardon me, I'll use some French then, Richard Toll. I
wondered when you mentioned him.
Pardon? Yeah.
I wondered when you mentioned him.
Yeah. Talk about a sociopath. Anyway, he had a paper, his model called FUND, was used by 2 other researchers plus himself to do a economic estimate of the impact of losing the Gulf Stream, and that's it's called the technical name is the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, and that's an enormous. That's a small part of the enormous river of ocean water that flows between all the oceans on the planet, distributing heat around the planet. And what he said in that was, if the AMOC gets shut down completely, when the global warming level is 3.5 degrees, that will improve GDP by 1%.
For whom?
Okay, yeah. So losing the AMOC, losing the Gulf Stream, which would plunge Europe into a mini ice age, that'll improve GDP. Now, why did he have that? Because, well, he just measures the whole thing, the whole relationship around temperature, and says, well, global warming of 3.5 degrees will push most of these countries past their optimum temperature. Okay. And then therefore the freezing coming from losing the Gulf Stream will push them back a bit. So that's going to make things better. And then, I mean, this is juvenile. I mean, you looked at it, and I haven't actually looked inside the model fund. It's written in, I think, Objective C, whereas you can easily read DICE because it's written in a language which just involves straight equations. It's very easy to read. So I didn't know the internal workings of fund, but in this 2016 paper shutting down the thermohaline circulation, I think it's called, he admits that his model only has temperature, it doesn't have precipitation.
Wow.
Okay. And he then said, we assume that other climatic variables scale with temperature, which means if temperature gets better, then we expect rainfall to get better too. We just assume that temperature will move in the same positive direction as rainfall. Now, this is juvenile.
Yeah.
And he thinks he's oppressive. He thinks he's a serious intellectual. Whereas scientists have done the same thing, looking at the AMOC, have described the impact was catastrophic because of the impact it will have on precipitation levels that he assumes are going to get better.
Well, all people need to know about Richard Toll is he said in a tweet once that we could easily adapt to 10 degrees of global warming, which is the single most stupid tweet I've ever seen anybody put on Twitter. But maybe, well, it's only a short show, so I thought maybe we could say something about TNL and the economic platform before we finish.
Yes.
There's so much to like in it. If it weren't for the branding issues involved, you could almost call TNL the deep greens. You've got the deep greens. I mean, they take the better greens economic policies and just push them a little bit further. There's the MMT lens. There's a job guarantee proposal. There's a focus on well-being, and maybe, and this will please our friend Phil Lawn, on a genuine progress indicator. But the thing that to me had the greatest obvious input from Steve was the housing market policy and the policy on household debt, which is related to it. And I wonder whether Steve would like to tell us something about
Sure.
those.
Okay. Well, if you look at the level of household debt, you go back 30 years, it was about 20% of GDP. Fast forward to today, it's 120% of GDP, 6 times the level it was compared to GDP. When you look back in the 60s and 70s, interest rates were much the same as they are now. So it's a much higher.
We're talking about Australia here, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Much higher debt burden on Australian households now than there was back in the 50s and 60s. So all that debt has been another way to create money. So that's letting the private banking sector create the money. But rather than creating money on one side and reserves on the other, which is what a government deficit does, this creates money on one side and a debt by those private individuals back to the banks again, meaning effectively that the finance sector has got the housing sector by the balls. And we're saying this was a mistake. This should never have happened. The government should create money by running a deficits. The private sector can create money by lending out more than it takes back in repayments. You need a balance between the two. You don't let the government ignore its role of money creation, leave it all to the private banking sector, which is what we've done. So we say, well, we can use the government's money creation capability to give everybody an identical amount of money, every resident, an identical amount of money through their bank accounts, which if they're in debt, they must use it to pay their debt down. And if they're not in debt, they get effectively a cash injection, which we could also make into getting government bonds earning about 3% interest. So everybody benefits. And the idea there is to reduce the level of household debt and increase the level of reserves that the bank sector has at the same time. And by doing that, we change the money from being backed by debt to being backed by government money creation, whether that's reserves or bonds. So
how big an amount do you think would be effective?
Effectively 100% of GDP, because you want to go from household debt being 120% now back to 20%, and you want to keep it there. So that is effectively creating an amount of money equivalent to 100% of GDP. But doing
how much? How much would that be per person? I'm just trying to get my head around it.
$100,000 isn't a bad guess about that level.
Okay. Yeah. But you can't just use it for whatever you want. You must pay your debt. It must be used
to pay debt down. Yeah.
Or if you have no debt,
then it becomes either government bonds, or we could potentially enable it to be used for like a house deposit. If you want to get rent, if you're a renter and you want to buy into the housing market, we could make it feasible to use that as well. Because of course, what's happened under all the Labor and Liberal policies to increase house ownership is a drastic fall in house ownership. We want to reverse that as well. So the first thing is what we call a monetary reset. Reduce the amount of credit-backed money, increase the amount of fiat, no change to the total amount of money, just change what backs that and use the government's capability to make up for that mistake. And then we would also bring in what I call the PIL, property income limited leverage. Okay. Rather than letting banks pretend they lend on the basis of the income of the borrower, require them to lend no more than a multiple of the income earning capacity of the property, the rental income, either real or prospective potential of a property, and aim to bring that down from its current level of about 20 times rental income. It's the average mortgage now is about 20 times the rental income of a property. Bring it down from 20 to 10, and then mean in the future we no longer have this desire to borrow more money to compete with somebody else to buy that property we want to buy, because there's a limit. Nobody can borrow more than X amount on that property. So if you want to buy it, you've got to save more money. And that will hopefully break the positive feedback cycle we see between a level of borrowing for housing and rising house prices. We just want to end that trap that what's causing house prices to rise is rising leverage.
Okay. I'd have to read that again to get my head around it.
Okay.
It's a very radical, interesting, you could say untested policy that there is there's definitely a hint of Hyman Minsky.
Oh yeah, I think Hyman would like this one. Yeah, I mean the basic thing, we have tested policies and they've all failed.
Yeah,
first home buyers grant, halving the rate of capital gains tax. Yeah.
Limiting the number of properties any one person can own.
Well, I think it would make it less desirable to do it, because at the moment they're only borrowing all these properties so they can make a profit on the rising value of the homes. Now we say house prices have to fall. We want to enable house prices to fall while maintaining the equity that people have in their houses. So this, if a couple gets 200,000, they pay their debt down by 200,000. If their house price falls by 200,000, they're just as well off, and in fact they're better off, because it'll take them a smaller amount of time to repay the lower amount of debt that they owe. So this benefits everybody in terms of home ownership, but it doesn't benefit landlords. If you're a landlord, not for the sake of rental income, but for the sake of capital appreciation, you're not going to like us, and that's your problem, not ours.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks very much for that explanation, Steve. Yeah, go on, Gabie.
I was just going to say, I think that would also, correct me if I'm wrong, but would do something about the amount of properties that are actually empty, which could have people in them. Yeah.
I mean, the only reason it's advantageous to keep a property empty is you're expecting capital appreciation. Yeah. Now we want to, house prices are too high compared to incomes. They can't be allowed to go any higher. We should bring them down. And in that situation, that particular avenue for landlords to get rich just by letting the prices rise is going to be removed. There are still some Georgist issues there, because of course, if you buy a property and a vacant block of land, and then 20 years later there's a train station next to the block of land, you benefit out of that social development. So there's still issues about how do you prevent that sort of a price appreciation happening. But you want to take out the price appreciation driven by higher levels of mortgage debt.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Everybody have a read of TNL's policies online.
And my own page, keenforthesenate.com.
Yes. Excellent.
And thanks very much for joining us today, Steve. And actually next week we're going to be joined by somebody who I think you know, an investment fund manager called Con Michalakis, who sends his regards. Con is an NMT enthusiast and is in the driving seat where the postgraduate courses that we're developing in Adelaide with Torrens University are concerned. And it'll be very interesting speaking to Con, as it has been to Steve today. All the best with your operation, Steve, and also all the best with the election. We mean it. Anything we can do to help Gabie and me and the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, we'd be more than happy to.
Or tweet the stuff around. Help me out on Twitter to begin with. Facebook would help as well. I'm hopeless on Facebook, but anyone to promote us, because the main problem we face is lack of awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
Yeah.
All right, Steve. Thanks, Steve. Great to talk to you. Great to meet you.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.